What would be a good book to read next? I am Joseph. This is Input English. For those of you joining us for the first time, Input English is created for comprehensible input so that people around the world can improve their listening comprehension and their speaking ability. In today's episode, I'd like to talk about some books, because books are input. Books are ways of improving our English without studying grammar and lists of vocabulary. That would be very boring and not very productive. Books are definitely a tool for the language learner. The question is, what book should I read next? Many times, the language learner is relegated to children's books, and that satisfies one need. That is, the book is easier to comprehend, but it's not very satisfying to an adult to read a children's book. We want to read a real book. We want to read a book written for adults. There are some in-between books that appeal to children and adults, and I showcased one of them in a previous video, that is The Little Prince. Today, I'd like to offer a specific recommendation of a book that you can read that's relatively straightforward to read, but it has a compelling story and very complex, interesting characters. Sounds good, doesn't it? What I'm talking about is Return of the Native. That book was written by Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was an interesting fellow. He was born in 1840 in England, and he studied architecture. He worked as an architect, but his love was poetry and writing literature. He wrote a number of novels, and I have read 4 of his novels. He lived until 1928. Return of the Native was published in 1878 when he was 38 years old. Frequently in the 19th century, books were published in a serialized way. That is, they would publish them in a magazine, and they would publish a chapter at a time. So it might take you a year to read a book because it was published serialized. That was the case with Return of the Native. Many of Hardy's books were published serialized. That was not peculiar of Thomas Hardy. Many authors published their books serialized. The 4 books of Thomas Hardy which I have read are arguably his best-known works: Far from the Madding Crowd, Return of the Native, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and Jude the Obscure. That was the order in which they were written, and that was the order in which I read them. While he was writing books and poetry, he was still working as an architect. It was the commercial success of Return of the Native that allowed him to abandon his job as an architect and be a full-time writer. Hardy is known for his beautiful use of the English language and for his ability to create complex and interesting characters. Hardy was very much influenced by the writing of George Eliot, who was one generation older. Now, George Eliot sounds like a man's name, but you may know that George Eliot was Mary Ann Evans, a woman who wrote under the pen name of George Eliot. She wrote a number of books and was an extraordinary writer. I've read 2 of her books, which we will talk about at another time. Today, let me list them as Silas Marner and Middlemarch. So back to Thomas Hardy. Why would I choose to recommend Return of the Native over all of these other books which I've mentioned. It's probably the easiest one to read. The language is not overly complex, and for a language learner, it's very inviting. It also offers you a number of options. There is a pitfall that you would notice very early in the book, and that is this book is set in the countryside in England in the 19th century. So some of the vocabulary is going to be very unfamiliar. Just a few words. One of the words that I tripped over was furze. F-U-R-Z-E, furze. And furze was a thorny shrub that grew in the country and was cut, harvested by people for use. Now, what could you use a thorny shrub for? Well, there are 4 known uses. 1, you can feed it to animals as fodder. Number 2, you can burn it as fuel. Number 3, you can pile it up and make a fence out of it. It's a thorny shrub and it's a barrier. So you can use it for fencing, and people did. And the last thing is you can extract a dye from it. You can cook it down and extract a dye that you can use, for instance, on cloth. In this book, Thomas Hardy describes furze cutters, that is, men who go out into the countryside and cut these shrubs and create bundles. But he doesn't call them bundles, he calls the bundles faggots. So the first thing you might notice is that he is describing a furze cutter carrying faggots. And this terminology, on first impression, may be very unfamiliar. But once you know the glossary, once you know what these words mean, it becomes normal. And there are very few terms in this book that will give you any trouble. The next term that you might trip over is heath. H-E-A-T-H. Heath. What is a heath? A heath is what we would call a field, a meadow, a grassland. A heath is a piece of land, perhaps a lowland, essentially devoid of trees with small shrubs or grass growing. So once you get past the furze cutters on the heath carrying faggots, and you understand what that means, everything else gets super easy. The next question arises, how do you read this book? Well, there are a number of options. Paperback versions or hardback versions of the book are readily available. So you could buy a physical book. You could download an ebook onto a device and read it on your device. Read it on a tablet. You could read this as an audiobook. And this has some very interesting options. Number 1, you could get the audiobook read by Alan Rickman. Now, you may recognize that name. Alan Rickman was a British actor, and he portrayed the character Snape in the Harry Potter movies. His version of Return of the Native is very easy to understand and a lot of fun. I highly recommend that. I have listened to that audiobook from beginning to end. Another option, let's say you were trying to listen to content with an American accent and you wanted to listen to this book as an audio book, but you'd prefer input with pronunciations typical of North America. Then you would want to go to the audiobook produced by Librivox. And I have links in the description for 2 YouTube videos, which amount to the entire audiobook, but it's read with an American accent. This Librivox video of the audiobook has an interesting feature, and that is it has the text, and the video underlines the text as it is being spoken by the narrator. So you can actually listen to the audiobook, but read along with it, and the cursor follows the words that are being said at any given moment. This is a feature that I have used on the Link app to foster my reading ability in Spanish. Another nice thing about reading it with the audiobook on the YouTube format is you have absolute control of the playback speed. So if you're listening to it and the speed is satisfactory, you leave it normal. However, if you find the words are coming a little too fast, you might slow it down to a 75% playback speed, giving your mind a little bit more time to process these words. What I notice when I do that, slowing down the playback, is I usually do it early on, and then as I get used to the way the speaker is pronouncing words and I get used to the writing style, then I'm able to speed it up to the normal speed. I do recommend all of the works of Thomas Hardy as very, very good literature, but by far I think this one is the easiest one to read. In future videos, we will discuss other works of great literature that you might want to put on your reading list so that you accomplish 2 things. You get extraordinary input in English, but also you get to enjoy great literature written in English. I invite comments below, and if you like videos like this, be sure to click on this one next. See you soon.